we're beginning here with the question of what makes us human. And what this is really focused on is the things that make human beings unique, and it's sort of the setup for what's going to follow in later lectures. Human beings originally evolved in Africa. Even today, Africans are the most genetically diverse human population, probably because simply that's the place where human beings have lived the longest in this world. Waves of hominids have moved out from Africa across the world. The Homo habilis, the Australopithecines, Homo erectus, archaic Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalis, and then of course us, modern Homo sapiens, have moved out from Africa and found homes for themselves in pretty much every part of the world. And you can sort of look at this map and it will show you all the various different places that they found remains of hominids. The question is, what makes it possible for humans to live in such a diverse array of environments? Humans remain basically the same around the world, despite some minor variations like skin color. A lot of the differences we look at from the outside and see as very important, skin color, eye shape, other kinds of sort of details like that, are actually, if you look at the genetic code, less than 1% of humans' differences are in there. And actually, if you look at it genetically, we're all pretty much the same. And the changes that we might from the outside seem as important are really not much of anything. So the question is, how can human beings live in such a wide variety of places without really changing much at all? So let's try a thought experiment here. Imagine that you are an organism faced with survival in a changing environment. You live in the southern Arctic, and for 3,500 years the climate has been relatively warm. Forests have grown across the tundra, providing a home for migrating caribou and musk oxen. The ice-free ocean inlets and bays are home to seals, whales, and walruses. The land provides a good living for hunters of large game. That's when the climate becomes colder. As the temperatures drop, the forests die, leaving sparse grasses and other vegetation. The caribou and the musk oxen shift their migration routes to the south. As ice returns to the bays and inlets, the whales, the seals, the walruses move farther out to sea. Survival becomes much harder. What do you do? And think about this first from the viewpoint of an ordinary animal. If that species was going to survive in this created new environment as it changes, what would they have to have? And you can even here pause if you wanted to think about that. For most species, the answer then would lie in physical differences. The species that was best adapted to the new climate will survive. Thus, species where they develop warm fur, extra layers of fat, which are going to protect against cold by providing extra heat, but also help protect against famine, and so you can go a longer periods between meals. White fur or feathers, a whole wide variety of things. So any of these species that have developed mutations that then allow the species to change in a way that's going to help them adapt, those are the kinds of changes that would be helpful for them. And in fact, if you look at the animals up there, that's exactly what they do have, as in this pretty picture. You've got, all these white animals with heavy layers of fur, thick layers of fat, all these whole wide varieties of adaptations. Okay, so that's great. That's what happens with the animals. What about human beings? And as we said, human beings really haven't changed for over 40,000 years. So if we're still basically the same, and yet we do know that people live in those kinds of Arctic conditions, so what are they doing to make it possible for them to live there? Oh, and if you're curious, that human being illustration is actually the one that the Pioneer spacecraft took with it out into outer space, hopefully to, if there's any intelligent life forms out there, this is how they're going to learn about humanity. Anyways. So, what do human beings do? And of course, how do human beings survive? They adapt through culture. Their bodies don't change much, but what does change, and changes dramatically, is the way that they live in there, their tools, their approaches to life. And this is a picture of an Inuit family from 1917, wearing very traditional clothing. And if you look at them, you'll see the kinds of things human beings do. You wear layered clothing to trap in the heat. You use every resource that you get from animals that are killed, anything you can find, as carefully and thoroughly as you can. So if you kill animals, you're going to not just eat the meat and preserve some of it, you're going to eat the fat and use some of the fat for other kinds of things like making skin oils for your skins. You're going to carve the bones for tools. You're going to make clothes out of the skin. Every single scrap of that animal is going to be put to work because you can't afford to. You don't have the resources to waste anything. Building winter homes with long entryways to protect the heat and keep it in place inside where it needs to be. Those igloos and kinds of things, that's like hunting shelters. But so typically you build these winter homes that you'll be in, and you'll have this long entryway that will keep the heat in. Eating foods high in protein and fat for energy. Learning to combine hunting on land and sea for more resources. A whole wide range of adaptations are possible. But that's how human beings do it. They change their cultures, not their bodies. So, human beings have a set of physical characteristics that make them different from other mammals, I guess. And so one of the characteristics that humans have is they are bipedal. And if you're looking at that word, it's bipedal, so bi for two, ped is for foot, so walking on 2 feet, upright. Possibly that is because it makes it easier for us to use tools in our hands. That's something that physical anthropologists still fight about a bit, why that is actually an advantage, but it does seem to be one that we have. That's also why we have such bad backs as a species. So bipedalism, that's one. 2, we have large brains. Really large brains compared to our body size, even though, for example, whales have bigger brains than us because they're bigger than us, but compared to our body size, we have some of the biggest brains out there. And they're not just large, they're also very complex and highly developed in a wide variety of ways. This allows us to think in abstracts, and possibly it allows us to have deeper, more profound emotions. It allows us to make connections between a variety of things, and it also allows us to develop complex social relationships. Though it's interesting, actually, the more research that has been done on some of the apes, like chimpanzees, gorillas, other apes, is actually interesting to discover that they actually have much more complex societies than we might have previously thought. But still, seems to be something unique about the human brain. Large brains, however, also have another consequence. They make our heads quite large, which creates problems for a woman giving birth. The head's the hard part to get out. So babies have to be born while their brains are still developing, and their heads, therefore, are not too large to be given birth to. That means that our children are born very unformed, very undeveloped, unlike, for example, cats or dogs, and they're going to have to do a lot of learning while their brains are still developing. This means that a lot of what human beings do is actually learned behavior rather than instinctive. It also means that the very way our brain works, what's going to be focused on, is developed by the teaching that is done with us, the interactions we have as a very, very young infant, early childhood. And this is so critical that if a child is raised in isolation, not exposed to human stimulation and language, the child may lose his ability to use language and to learn, and that will never be restored. Later on, they might be able to learn some words, some phrases, but that ability to use complex languages is just not really going to be there. So in a lot of ways, what makes it possible for us to have culture is the amount of time we spend developing in it, and the way it physically shapes us as well as mentally shapes us. This also means that when we develop societies, we have to develop societies where prolonged care is provided for children through some means, that there has to be someone there who's going to help raise and teach and protect those children because they can't make it on their own for years. So, what does this for us? This is the fourth sort of characteristic that we have, is we have language. Homo sapiens have language. As you can see, I borrowed this slide, so it's maybe a little bit different in style, but Homo sapiens have language that we can use to communicate, and we can use to exchange complex ideas with each other. It's not just because of our large brain that makes this possible. It's also because of the way that our throats are designed. We can make a wide range of, because of our larynx, we can make a wide range of sounds, much more than, for example, chimpanzees could. That's part of what makes it possible for us to have these complex languages that we do. As we share ideas with each other and have complex ideas, it makes it easier for us to store those ideas and add them to the ideas of previous generations. Then because you exchange ideas, people keep finding new ways of doing things, new ideas, building off of those old ideas. And that creativity, which is partially founded not just on an idea that someone has at the time, but also their knowledge of the past, of things that have worked, and possibly even their exposure to other people from different societies, different cultures, that allows human beings new ways to innovate, new ways of doing things, new ways of living. And that's what we call, or at least anthropologists and some historians call, collective learning. What that means is each individual has not only his or her own experiences, but he or she can share experiences and ideas with others through memory, through record keeping, through all these means. He or she can also draw on the experiences and ideas of previous generations. And it's actually interesting if you look at societies that are not literate, they don't use writing. In those societies, they're also very careful to have ways of keeping the past alive and keeping memory alive. And so, for example, in some cases it can be a purely oral tradition, repeating it, but not uncommonly, they may not have writing, but they'll develop mnemonics, ways of marking on sticks as a way of sort of cueing the memories of what happened in various different years, or keeping markings, making markings annually on skins or rocks or various different ways. And so that record keeping, even though societies may have different ideas about what's important to keep in records, we do seem to share that as an important goal. And having that collective learning makes it possible for us to continue to innovate. And so what that does is that creates culture. The skills, the ideas, the values, the material objects such as dwelling, clothing, tools, and crafts, all the things that make up our society, those things are culture. And culture, being the entire way of life of a people, is not just something we develop as adults or take part in as adults. Like we said before, it's something that is actually physically built into us. And here we're back at the undeveloped baby brains. Culture is so critical for us because our brains are partially shaped by it. Like we said, for example, a child raised in isolation will not develop that ability to communicate. And that's actually been one of the things they've discovered more recently, and one of the reasons why it's become so important to use, for example, sign language very early on with children who, for reasons of hearing, other reasons, are going to have difficulties developing spoken language, because that is still, sign language is still a language, and that will give them the ability to learn how to use language to communicate with others. And if they don't get that, they may not develop that at all. So we shape our children to participate in culture, and that ability, so that in a sense our culture is built into ourselves. So for example, if you are growing up learning Chinese, which is a tonal language, you're going to develop your brain in ways that makes it easier for you to use a tonal language than an English speaker with English not being a tonal language would. But it also gives us the skills we need to communicate and participate in other cultures and communicate with them later on. And of course, that culture is back, sort of bringing it all full circle. That's what allows us to adapt to different environments, different ways of life around the world, just like that Inuit family back in slide 7, just like all the various people, all the various ways of life that we see around this globe. Ultimately, culture is what makes us different, and what makes us as humans different and unique from other animals. So if you want to look at what makes human beings human, culture is what does that.